In the depths of the human soul there sometimes lies an inexplicable sadness, a heaviness that weighs on the heart as if it were a burden that does not belong to us yet follows us relentlessly from within. Many generations were raised by mothers whose hearts held incurable wounds, pains that were never allowed to heal. These hidden sufferings, veiled under a mask of strength, self-sacrifice, suppressed anger or suffocating love, were invisibly passed down from generation to generation. This was not a punishment, but rather a silent plea, a hope that one day a brave soul would be found to break this vicious cycle. Carl Jung once noted that unresolved internal conflicts manifest in the external world as inevitable fate. If the mother did not have the strength to face her pain, if her mother also failed to do so, then who will take on this burden? Perhaps this responsibility seems insurmountable, but what if it is, in reality, the greatest act of love ever to be performed for one's family? Transforming received knowledge is an act of awareness, for it is awareness that opens the path to healing, and healing, in turn, grants freedom to move forward. Entering this delicate path, it is worth arming oneself with a compass in the form of Carl Jung and a map woven from personal history. Sometimes a person carries a burden whose nature remains a mystery. In search of explanations, the mind turns to childhood memories, analyzes relationships and one's own actions. However, the feeling that the root cause lies somewhere deeper, in more ancient layers of being, does not leave. Carl Jung referred to this phenomenon as the collective unconscious, a spiritual heritage that includes not only archetypes, but also emotional traces, unspoken sufferings passed down from generation to generation. Perhaps this manifests as an unceasing inner anxiety, or as a recurring scenario in relationships that is reproduced time and again, despite awareness of its destructiveness. It may be felt as a sense of guilt that has no real basis in personal biography, or as a constant desire to be strong, dictated by a deep-seated belief that otherwise no one will be able to take on this role. The truth of life is that not every suffering that pierces the soul arises directly from personal experience. Some painful sensations are rooted deep in time, in the fate of the mother and her predecessors, forming a complex web of generations. Trauma that has not received proper healing is like an unstoppable flow striving to break free. It does not freeze in place, but continues its journey, often transmitted through blood ties, behavioral patterns, and painful silence. And at some point, it finds someone who must feel its burden in order to finally transform it. Perhaps that person is you. And this is not a curse, but a unique opportunity. After all, he who realizes that the pain he carries did not originate in his own heart is able to decide that it is in him that it must find its end. For the eminent psychoanalyst Carl Jung, the mother represented not only a real person, but also a deep inner image, an archetype, a powerful spiritual figure that influences every person, often unconsciously but with colossal force. The mother is the first world we encounter. Her gaze reflects us long before we gain the ability to see ourselves independently. Her voice, her emotional state, her silence, all this is imprinted on our soul, like an invisible script. Jung repeatedly noted that people often live their lives not following their own path, but obeying an inner image that they have never questioned. And very often this image is the mother, not the mother as she was in reality, but what her unresolved problems left us in inheritance. When a woman has not known true love, it can be difficult for her to generously give that feeling to her children. If self-sacrifice has prevailed in her life, she may involuntarily expect the same from her descendants. Not having been heard in the past, she may listen to the words of her children, but through the prism of her own emotional wounds. As a result, children become carriers of other people's aspirations, trying to fill the maternal void and living a life that does not belong to them. Or they are forced to struggle with a sense of guilt that has never been voiced. As Jung astutely noted, until a person becomes aware of the contents of their unconscious, it will relentlessly control their life, and they will naively accept it as fate. Thus, healing begins with the realization of what is truly one's own and what was adopted out of love, loyalty, or simply because no one pointed out the error of such a choice. Before becoming a mother, every woman was a young girl, full of dreams and fears, with a personal history that began long before her children were born. But how often do we think about this? In the minds of many, a mother appears as an unshakable and all-powerful figure, always ready to help and fulfill her functions. However, the image we create often turns out to be incomplete, because few people wonder what she was like before the trials of life left their mark on her. Probably, in childhood, she was particularly susceptible and forced to temper her character. Perhaps she was reproached for excessive emotionality, which forced her to learn to restrain her feelings. It is possible that her dreams never had the opportunity to be realized. Perhaps she longed for love, but encountered only manifestations of control or indifference. All this, of course, influenced the formation of her personality, and she unconsciously transferred all this into her role as a mother, not out of malice, but simply because she acted based on her life experience. As Jung noted, often people act not of their own free will, but under the influence of internal needs. These needs, in turn, arise from old, unhealed wounds. Perhaps her maternal love manifested itself in a peculiar way. However, love alone is not enough when the emotional pain is too strong. After all, a wounded heart is not able to open completely. It seeks to protect itself and sometimes unintentionally hurts others. When a person begins to see in his mother not only a parent, but also a woman with her own history and personal experiences, something amazing happens. He frees himself from ideas about an ideal or guilty mother and discovers the path to true compassion. This compassion is not needed to save the mother, but to free himself. Perhaps in childhood you were not just a child, but an attentive listener, a faithful comforter, and a skilled peacemaker. Perhaps you intuitively felt your mother's sadness, even when she didn't say a word. Probably you learned early to be careful so as not to burden her with your problems, or you became strong so that she could find support in you. Children have an amazing ability to pick up on the unspoken, feeling the tension long before they find the words to express it. And when a mother suffers, whether emotionally, mentally, or under the burden of life's circumstances, the child often grows up with an unconscious desire to save her. Thus begins the imperceptible substitution of roles when the child becomes a reliable support for the mother, a source of meaning, comfort, and attention. He learns that his value is determined by how much better he makes her feel. But what happens to a child who can never truly relax, who suppresses his own feelings to make room for someone else's pain? Often he grows up with a deep inner emptiness, with a feeling that he is never enough, or conversely, too much. He experiences constant internal pressure, forcing him to be strong, useful, and not to be a burden. Many adults who today suffer from exhaustion, excessive responsibility, or emotional detachment, in their depths hold just this story, not as a conscious memory, but as a deeply rooted life scenario. As Jung said, the soul remembers what the mind forgets. When a person grew up feeling the suffering of his mother, he probably still carries the burden of responsibility that was not originally supposed to be his. It is time to return to yourself what rightfully belongs to another, but to do it not out of a sense of resentment, but out of love and compassion. True love does not need a burden, it flourishes in freedom. There are words that have never been spoken but nevertheless had a huge impact on life. Glances that avoid direct contact, topics that have become taboo, feelings that hang in the air like an invisible wall. All this remains unspoken, but is felt everywhere. In many families, the most important thing is not what is said aloud, but what is carefully hidden. Silence about the mother's pain, about her fears, about the past, about dreams that were never destined to come true. It is this silence that becomes the language through which the child begins to form an idea of himself. Perhaps a person considered himself calm, strong, and reasonable by nature. Perhaps he learned early to control his emotions, because there was no place for the manifestation of rage, sadness, or other strong feelings in his environment. Perhaps he adapted to the circumstances not of his own free will, but because it was the only way to earn love and recognition. But what if the image of oneself that a person has created is not really his true self? What if he found himself in a silence that does not belong to him at all? Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, those aspects of personality that we suppress because there was no place for them in the family system. Often these suppressed parts hold our life force, creativity, ability to set boundaries, express anger, and speak the truth. Prolonged silence, like a thick shadow, can transform into an integral part of one's personality. A person convinces themselves of their adaptability, strength of spirit, and ability to overcome any obstacles. However, behind this facade often lies only a defense mechanism erected to conceal true feelings. It takes considerable courage to break the chains of silence, not to point fingers at the guilty, but to discover oneself. For a person's true essence lies not in suppressing emotions, but in the ability to experience them. But why does the pursuit of freedom sometimes feel wrong? Why is joy mixed with quiet pain when a person goes their own way? And why does guilt arise when breaking ties, even when necessary? The answer lies in a subtle feeling, unconscious guilt. If a person's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of sadness or a mother's self-sacrifice, then any manifestation of self-determination can be perceived as betrayal, as abandoning her to her fate, as a declaration of a desire for a different life. And this causes sharp pain, not because of a lack of love, but because of a deep connection that has grown over the years through shared experiences and unspoken devotion. It is this devotion that often becomes the main obstacle to true freedom. As Jung noted, the human self strives for development, but the unconscious holds back what has not yet been resolved and released. It is possible that the lack of career growth is due to a subconscious feeling that professional success would diminish the significance of the mother. Perhaps the choice fell on those relationships that would find understanding with her. It is likely that a person unconsciously restrained their potential, driven by love or fear that their personal happiness would be a painful reminder of her emotional wounds. However, it is worth realizing that happiness is not an act of aggression, and freedom is not a threat, but an opportunity to start life with a clean slate. The unconscious sense of guilt only seeks to be noticed and acknowledged. And when this happens, it becomes possible to enter into a dialogue with it, not as an adversary, but as a vulnerable child who never knew that they were allowed to be free. Freedom, unburdened by guilt, is an achievable goal. The path to it begins with allowing oneself to choose oneself, without fear of losing connection with loved ones. A person could have vowed to act differently, not to repeat their mother's mistakes, not to remain silent, and not to suffer as she did. And yet, despite these intentions, they find themselves again in situations reminiscent of the past, face the same fears, and feel the same inner emptiness. The reason lies in the fact that unresolved psychological traumas tend to recur. This happens not out of malice, but out of a deep need to understand what was once left misunderstood and unresolved. It often happens that a person's life path is marked by the repetition of certain scenarios, like echoes of past experiences. For example, the choice of a partner may unconsciously fall on an emotionally distant person, like a father, which makes one remember the mother's suffering from such coldness. With the arrival of children, a person may face difficulties in meeting their needs, fearing the loss of their own identity, as once happened with their mother. Or, striving for a sense of significance, an individual plunges headlong into work, trying to compensate for a long-standing feeling of their own inferiority. Such repetitions are not just a coincidence, but rather a manifestation of a deep hope to change the course of events, to find a new answer to old questions. Carl Jung, a famous Swiss psychiatrist and philosopher, called these complex emotional knots that secretly control our lives until we become aware of their existence and bring them to the light of consciousness. You should not blame yourself for falling into the trap of old patterns of behavior. This is inherent in human nature. It is important to remember that awareness of these patterns is the first step towards change. Instead of condemning yourself for repeating what you would like to heal, you need to stop and carefully consider the situation. You should see the repeating pattern, call it by its name, and ask yourself the question, what did I, as a child, want to hear, feel, experience at that moment? Give yourself today what was missing in the past. Only then will it be possible not just to live the pattern but to transform it, opening the way to healing and personal growth. Invisible forces, like shadows, subtly control human life. These unnamed influences acting from behind the scenes of consciousness shape feelings, actions, and the boundaries of personality, often without awareness of the true causes of what is happening. The first step toward emotional healing isn't deep analysis, but a simple yet courageous act, naming, speaking aloud what has long remained unexpressed. Perhaps for the first time you manage to find the words to describe what previously felt like a vague sensation. It might sound like this. I felt sadness that no one wanted to notice. I felt responsible for the well-being of my mother, who herself needed support. I suppressed my own needs because there was no room for them. I kept silent to earn love. Uttering these words creates a space for inner truth, a sacred place where innermost experiences find a voice. After all, what is spoken ceases to be a secret weapon turned against oneself. It gets the chance to breathe freely, freeing the individual from oppression. As Carl Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Naming the pain does not mean plunging into the abyss of suffering, but acknowledging it as an integral part of one's personal history, though not as an inevitable destiny. Many people have strived for decades to be strong, adaptable, and functional members of society. However, true strength lies not in carrying an unbearable burden, but in admitting, this was too much, and I deserve better. The pain should be named not to dwell on it, but to let it go. After all, only what is recognized and accepted can be left in the past. In the process of deep self-analysis and reflection on personal history, moments often arise when a person is overwhelmed by feelings of blame, anger, and resentment, causing them to question why proper protection and support were not provided. These emotions are certainly natural and understandable, but true healing begins not with finding the guilty. It originates in an honest and unbiased awareness of the past, in the ability to recognize the pain experienced without allowing it to turn into shackles, and in the ability to see the mother as she really was. An ordinary person with her weaknesses and limitations. Perhaps she inflicted emotional wounds, left you alone with emotional difficulties, or belittled your dignity because she herself never knew what it meant to feel significant. But quite possibly, she also showed love as sincerely and devotedly as she could. Perhaps she simply wasn't taught other ways to express feelings. It's likely that she gave the best she had, even if it wasn't enough to meet all your needs. As Carl Jung stated, true individuation, that is, the process of maturing and finding one's true self, becomes possible only when a person frees their parents from projections, ceases to idealize or demonize them. When the ability arises to say, "You hurt me, and I see your pain." Reconciliation is not just an act of formal agreement or approval. It is rather a decision to stop carrying the burden of grievances and pain. By letting go of the past, a person strives for inner freedom, not for justifying others. It is in this freedom that the potential for something new is born, a compassionate view of the world, an inner dialogue that brings peace and perhaps even genuine intimacy. Ultimately, it is a quiet agreement with oneself. Healing that does not seek the guilty is not a sign of weakness, but a powerful step toward liberating oneself and future generations. This process begins imperceptibly, with the awareness of pain that can no longer be ignored, and with finding the courage within oneself to feel, act, and be different. Suddenly, the realization comes that a person is not only a product of the past, but also the creator of a new future. Perhaps they will be the first in their family to consciously look at the situation, recognize established patterns of behavior, not for condemnation, but for transformation. It is within their power to break the vicious cycle, moving from silence to open conversation, from guilt to compassion, from repeating mistakes to freedom of choice. As Carl Jung said, the integrity of the personality is achieved through the integration of shadow aspects. It is this path of transformation that a person begins when they boldly face their history, creating a space where healing becomes possible for themselves, their descendants, and all of life. It is quite likely that fully resolving all life's problems will prove to be an unattainable task, and some questions will remain unanswered, and emotional wounds will continue to ache. Nevertheless, it is within everyone's power to interrupt the chain of transmission of these problems and traumas to the next generations. One can make the decision that this transmission ends with them. Such a step is not just a personal decision, but an act of transgenerational liberation, a kind of quiet revolution taking place within the family, an invisible legacy that continues to have an impact, even remaining unnoticed. An individual has the power to reshape their family's narrative, not by seeking flawlessness, but by facing truths and choosing a different path. Reaching this point signifies an awareness that the journey is challenging yet authentic. It's recognizing that some wounds stem from the past, that a mother, both strong and vulnerable, near and distant, is a product of her own story, and that the opportunity to change this exists now. What actions can be taken in the present? Honesty is paramount, even if spoken with a trembling voice. Writing a letter to one's mother or oneself, expressing unspoken sentiments with compassion, not guilt, can be transformative. Establishing firm boundaries based on self-love and respect is crucial. Freedom requires space, which arises from prioritizing one's needs and limits. Avoid assuming excessive responsibility for others' problems. One's purpose isn't to heal a mother's pain, but to live one's own life. Seeking support from others is essential. Healing doesn't occur in isolation. The guidance of a qualified therapist, participation in a support group, or an open conversation with an understanding individual can significantly alter the course. Forgiveness is necessary for inherited traits, repeated mistakes, and the decision to end the cycle. Ultimately, the core truth remains: solving every problem isn't required. Simply initiating the break from the vicious cycle often suffices to heal on an unseen level. An individual becomes the originator of a new narrative, a bridge connecting past and future. This in itself is an invaluable gift for oneself, those who came before, and those who will follow. Maintaining self-awareness, gentleness, and vigilance is vital on this journey. To effectively rephrase the text, several principles must be strictly followed. Primarily, preserving the original material's length and structure is important. The rephrased text should be similar in size to the original, with the paragraph divisions and the order of ideas remaining consistent. If needed, individual ideas can be expanded by adding details and specific examples to maintain length and deepen understanding of the topic. Enriching the language is a key element of the rephrasing process. This involves actively using synonyms, diversifying grammatical structures, and employing expressive devices to make the text lively and engaging. It is important to avoid repetitions and tautologies, striving for maximum linguistic expression. It is equally important to keep the factual information and terminology unchanged. Proper names, specialized terms, numerical values, and other factual data should be transferred to the rephrased text without alterations. This will maintain the accuracy and reliability of the information. The tone and style of the rephrased text should match the original. Regardless of whether the source text is serious, casual, technical, or otherwise, it is important to maintain the appropriate tone. In this case, a journalistic style of writing should be adopted, which involves using clear and expressive language aimed at a broad audience. The main idea and purpose of the original text should be clearly reflected in the rephrased version. The reader should easily understand what is being discussed and what key thoughts the author intended to convey. Finally, the text should always be written in the third person to maintain objectivity and detachment in the narrative.